There is a story the Bible tells in 6 verses, and then never explains. 6 verses, that is all. It speaks of angels who left heaven. It speaks of women who bore children to them. It speaks of giants who walked the earth, and of men of renown whose names were remembered long after their bodies were gone. And then Scripture moves on, as if the subject were too heavy to carry. But something happened in those days, something that corrupted the earth so completely that God chose to drown it. This is the story of the Nephilim. The world was young then, older than we imagine, but young in the way a wound is young before it festers. Men lived for centuries. A father could look into the face of his great-grandson and remember the garden his own grandfather had described to him. Memory was long in those days. And so was pride. The generations of Adam had multiplied across the plains. Cities of mud and stone rose along the rivers. Herds covered the hills. The earth gave freely, and men took freely, and slowly they forgot the hand that had made it. It was the time of Jared, the 6th from Adam, and in his days the heavens were watching. Not with the distant patience of stars, watching the way a man watches something he desires. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. The sons of God. Scripture uses that phrase carefully. In the ancient tongue, it did not mean men. It meant beings of the heavenly court, beings who stood in the presence of the Almighty and were given a task. They were called the Watchers. Their assignment was simple: observe, guard, record. They were placed over the earth as guardians over a child, and they were never meant to touch what they guarded. They watched the harvests. They watched the births. They watched the funerals and the wars and the small human cruelties that were beginning to spread. And then they watched the women. Something moved in them that was not part of their design. Scripture does not tell us how it began. It only tells us where it ended. They wanted, and beings of that order were never meant to want. They gathered on the shoulder of a mountain in the north, a high place of cold stone and thin air. The men below called it Hermon. In the old writings, its name would come to mean the Mountain of the Oath. 200 of them came. Their leader was called Semjaza. He stood before the others and spoke what all of them were already thinking. He said, "I fear you will not go through with this." He said, "I fear I alone will bear the punishment." And the others answered him together, "Let us swear an oath. Let us bind ourselves by a curse, that none of us will turn back." They swore it. 200 voices on a mountain, binding themselves to a choice they could not undo. They knew what they were doing. That is the part men forget. These were not simple creatures acting on instinct. They had stood in the light of the throne. They understood the law they were breaking, and they broke it with their eyes open. Then they came down. The ground shook when they touched it. The air moved wrong around them. Men who saw them fell to the earth and could not rise, because their forms were radiant and terrible, and shaped like nothing born of dust. They took wives from among the daughters of men, and the women who were taken did not resist, because who resists a god? And then the Watchers began to teach. This is the part of the story that unsettles the scholars, because the sin was not only the union, the sin was the knowledge. One of them was called Azazel. He taught men to beat metal into blades. He taught them to forge shields and breastplates, to make the sword and the spear and the arrow that flies farther than a man can run. Before him, men fought with stones and fists. After him, men fought with iron. He taught the women too. He taught them to grind stones into color, to paint the eye, to shape the face into something that could be used as a weapon of its own. Another taught the cutting of roots and the mixing of herbs, and the words spoken over them. Another taught the reading of the stars, and how to draw meaning from them, and how to bend that meaning into prophecy. Another taught the signs of the sun, another the signs of the moon, another the breaking of spells and the binding of them. Knowledge poured down from the mountain like water down a slope, and none of it had been given. All of it had been stolen. Think about what that did to a village. For centuries, a man settled a dispute with his neighbor by shouting, and sometimes by fists, and then by sitting down together because they still had to share the same well. Now one of them had a blade. The argument did not change. The ending did. And the men who learned first did not teach the men who learned last. They ruled them. That is what a weapon is, before it is anything else. It is a shortcut past the conversation. The watchers watched this happen, and they were pleased. They had wanted to be needed, and now they were. Men came up the slopes of Hermon carrying gifts, asking for more metal, more signs, more words to say over the roots. And there was always more. That was the terrible generosity of it. The watchers never ran out, because they were spending something that had never belonged to them. The old writings keep a list of their names, and beside each name, the thing he taught. It reads like a ledger of everything that would go wrong with the world. And the earth changed. Villages that had known only the plow now knew the sword. Tribes that had bartered now raided. A man who could kill from a distance became a man who did not need to be right. The blood began to run, and it did not stop running. Then the children were born. They were not like other children. They came out large, and they kept growing, and they did not stop when a man stops. By their 10th year they stood taller than their fathers. By their 20th, they had to bend to pass under a doorway. And they kept going. Scripture names them without ceremony. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Men of renown, famous men, men whose names were sung in the villages long before anyone thought to be afraid of them. The Nephilim. At first, they were useful. A creature that tall could clear a field in a morning. He could carry a stone that 10 men could not move. He could stand at the edge of the camp at night, and no wolf would come near. The tribes fed them gladly. But a body like that needs feeding, and the appetite grew with the frame. They ate the harvest, then they ate the herds, then they ate the wild things in the hills until the hills went silent. And when there was nothing left in the hills, they came back down. They turned on the men who had raised them. The old writings describe it in a single sentence that has never lost its horror. They began to devour mankind. Picture a village at the end of a harvest. The grain is in. The children are asleep. And the ground begins to shake in a slow rhythm. And every adult in that village knows exactly what that rhythm is, because they have heard it before. Nobody runs. There is nowhere to run to that is faster than a stride 4 times the length of your own. So they wait, and in the morning the ones who are left rebuild and plant again and feed the thing that will come back. That was daily life for generations, not a legend, not a monster in a story told to frighten children, a schedule. And after mankind, they turned on each other. Something else was happening too, something harder to describe. The natural order began to slip. Creatures appeared that had no name and no lineage. Things that should not have been able to breed had bred. The line between one kind and another was blurring, and once blurred, it could not be redrawn. The earth itself began to protest. Rivers ran heavy and sour. The soil gave less each season. Birds abandoned the valleys and did not return. Men who had lived 400 years said they had never seen the sky hold that color. And the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Understand what corruption means here. It does not mean people were rude. It does not mean they skipped their prayers. It means the design was breaking. Flesh, blood, lineage, kind. The pattern that had been set in the beginning was coming apart, and the ones who had come to guard it were the ones tearing it. The Nephilim built cities. Real ones, of stone stacked higher than stone had ever been stacked. They ruled from them like kings, and the tribes below them stopped calling them monsters and started calling them gods. Altars went up. Sacrifices burned. Men bowed to the children of the Watchers and forgot the name of the one who made the Watchers. And it made a kind of sense. That is the uncomfortable part. If you had never seen God, and you had seen a being 12 feet tall who could hold back a flood of raiders with one arm, which one would you build the altar to? The temptation was not stupidity, it was evidence. The giants were visible, and the Almighty was not, and an entire civilization made its choice on that basis. Fathers taught it to sons. Sons taught it to their own. Within a few generations, there were men alive who had never once heard the name of the Creator spoken out loud, in any context, by anyone. That is what the flood was answering. Not bad behavior, total forgetting. And in the middle of all of it, there was one man who would not bow. His name was Enoch, the 7th from Adam, a man who, Scripture says, walked with God. He was not a soldier. He had no army, no city, no giant standing behind him. He was an old man in plain cloth who walked into places where nobody wanted him and said things nobody wanted to hear. He stood in the shadow of those stone cities, and he raised his voice. He said, "You who were of heaven have left your high places." He said, "You have defiled yourselves with the daughters of the earth." He said, "There will be no peace for you." The crowds mocked him. The giants did not even look down, but the Watchers heard him, and the Watchers were afraid. Because they knew he was not guessing. Enoch was taken up. Scripture states it plainly and moves on, but the old writings say more. They say he was carried into the heavens. They say he saw halls of fire and rivers of light. They say he saw the books opened, and the names written in them, and the names struck out of them. He described what he saw the only way a man can describe something with no earthly equal, by comparison, and badly. A house built of crystal, with a floor of fire and a ceiling of lightning. A second house, greater than the first, and inside it a throne, and the appearance of the sun beneath it, and a voice. He wrote that the cold of the first house and the heat of the second were both present at once, and that he fell on his face and trembled. And then the voice told him to stand up and to go back down and to carry a message to beings who had once stood closer to that throne than he ever would. That is the detail worth holding on to. Enoch was not chosen because he was powerful. He was chosen because he was still listening. Everyone else had stopped. And when he came back, the Watchers came to him. Not with threats, with paper. They wrote out their petition, and they placed it in his hands, and they asked the old man to carry it up and beg on their behalf. 200 beings who had stood before the throne, asking a mortal to speak for them, because they no longer could. Enoch took it. He carried it up, and he came back with tears in his eyes and a sentence in his mouth. He said, "Your petition has been refused." He said, "You will see your children destroyed before your own eyes." Toit. He said, "And you will be bound in the earth until the day of judgment." That was the moment the age ended. Everything that follows is only the sentence being carried out. Before the judgment falls, one thing. If this is the kind of story you were never told in church, subscribe. There is a new biblical film on this channel every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Now, back to the four who were called. In heaven, 4 names were called: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel. They came before the throne and they received their orders, and every one of those orders was a piece of the same judgment. Raphael was sent for Azazel. He found him in the wilderness, in a place the old writings call Dudael. He bound him hand and foot. He cast him into a pit in the rock and covered him in darkness, and rolled stones over the opening so no light would ever reach him again. And the word given was this: there he would remain until the great day of judgment, when he would be cast into the fire. Azazel, who had taught men to forge blades, was buried under stone by a being who never lifted one. Gabriel was sent to the giants. His work was quieter and far more cruel. He did not fight them. He set them against each other. Suspicion moved through the stone cities like smoke. Clans that had ruled together for centuries turned. Brothers accused brothers. Alliances broke in a single night over a word that no one could prove had been spoken. And then the wars began. Giant against giant, in valleys that could not hold them. They tore down their own towers to use as weapons. They drove each other into the rivers. The ground shook for weeks at a time, and the men who lived in the low places listened in the dark and understood that something enormous was ending. There is something worth noticing in the way this judgment was carried out. Gabriel did not destroy them. He let them destroy themselves. Everything the Watchers had given their children was turned around and handed back. The strength became the weapon. The pride became the fuse. The knowledge of war that Azazel had poured down the mountain came back up it and burned the ones who had carried it. The tribes below did not celebrate. They hid and they buried their dead, and they waited, because a war between gods is not a rescue. It is only a different way to die. By the end, the stone cities stood empty. Towers with no one to climb them. Altars with no one left to worship at them. The age of the Nephilim did not end at the flood. It ended before the first drop fell. Michael was sent for the rest of the Watchers. One by one, he found them. They had scattered into caves and mountain fastnesses, and they were not radiant anymore. They trembled when he came. He bound them in the valleys of the earth and sealed them there, and over the seal he set stones of fire that no hand would ever move. 200 beings who had sworn an oath on a mountain now sealed beneath one. Uriel was sent to the sons of men to tell them what was coming. And while all of this was happening, in a valley far from the stone cities, one man was building a boat. Noah was not a warrior and not a prophet. He was a farmer with 3 sons and a wife and a reputation for being strange. He worked the ground with his hands, and he listened for a voice that most men had stopped believing in. One night that voice spoke. "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth." "Make thee an ark of gopher wood." Noah did not argue. Scripture records no protest, no bargaining, no request for a sign. He got up in the morning and he started cutting timber. It took years. The measurements were given and he followed them exactly. 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high, 3 decks, 1 door, 1 window. Consider what those years cost him. He was not building in a week of inspiration. He was building through decades of ordinary mornings in a valley where nothing was happening, for a flood that had never happened before, in a world where it had possibly never rained the way we understand rain. Every day he woke up and chose to believe the same thing again. His sons grew up inside that decision. They learned to cut timber before they learned anything else. They married women who had to accept, as a condition of the marriage, that their father-in-law was building a boat on dry ground. His neighbors came to watch, the way people come to watch a man lose his mind. They asked him where the water would come from. They asked him if he planned to sail his box across the desert. They laughed. And then they got bored of laughing. And then they stopped coming at all. Noah kept building. And then the animals came. They came in pairs, from directions no man had driven them. Cattle and creeping things, and every bird after its kind, moving toward the ark, with the calm of creatures following an order they had heard clearly. Noah went in with his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. 8 people. And the door was shut! Scripture is very specific about that detail. Noah did not shut it. The Lord shut him in. Then it began. The fountains of the great deep broke open. That is the phrase, and it does not describe rain. It describes the earth splitting from below, water driven upward through rock with a force that threw stone into the sky. And at the same moment, the windows of heaven opened, and the water came down as well, above and below at once. The men in the low villages ran for the temples first. They called on the gods they had carved, and the gods they had carved said nothing, because they had never said anything. Then they ran for the hills. And the giants ran with them. This is the image the old writings never let go of. The Nephilim, the men of renown, the ones who had been worshipped, climbing. They had the advantage of height and reach and strength beyond measure, and none of it mattered because the water did not care how tall a thing was. One of them, a giant remembered in the old accounts, roared at the sky and demanded to know if this was the answer. The sky answered with thunder and nothing else. Another swam. His arms cut the water like oars, and he swam until there was no direction left to swim in, and the deep took him the way it takes everything. The screaming lasted a long time. Then it did not. And in the pits beneath the earth, the watchers heard all of it. Bound in darkness, unable to move, unable to look away, listening to their own children die in the flood their choice had caused. That was the sentence Enoch had carried down the mountain. Not death, not fire, not yet. Only this, you will listen. The rain fell 40 days and 40 nights. The waters rose above the mountains. Every living thing on the face of the ground was destroyed, and the ark floated over a world that no longer existed. And then it stopped. The wind moved over the water. The fountains were closed. The rain was shut up. The waters went down, slowly, the way a fever breaks. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Noah opened the window and sent out a raven, and it did not come back. He sent a dove, and it returned to his hand because there was nowhere for it to land. He waited 7 days and sent it again, and that time it came back with an olive leaf in its beak. When he finally opened the door, the world was silent. No cities, no towers, no altars, no stone kings. Everything the Nephilim had built was under mud, and everything they had been was under water. Noah built an altar out of loose stones and burned an offering on it, and the smoke went up into a clean sky. And God set a bow in the clouds, a promise in color stretched across the same heavens that had opened. The earth would not be destroyed by water again. That should be the end of the story. It is not. Because centuries later, when Moses sent 12 men into the land of Canaan to see what was there, 10 of them came back pale. They said the land was good. They said the fruit was heavy. And then they said something else. We saw the giants there, the sons of Enoch, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. The word they used was Nephilim. The names had changed. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim. Different tribes, different territories, the same shadow. There was a king in Bashan called Og, and Scripture records the length of his bed in iron, because no one would have believed the number otherwise. There was a champion in Gath, almost 3 meters tall, who stood in a valley for 40 days and dared an entire army to send him one man. And the man they sent was a shepherd boy with 5 smooth stones. People remember that one. Almost nobody remembers what came after it. Goliath had brothers. Scripture names them, and it names the men who put them in the ground. Ishbi-Benob, who carried a spear of bronze and nearly killed David in his old age, struck down by Abishai. Saph, killed by Sibbecai. Lahmi, the brother of Goliath, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, killed by Elhanan. And one more, a giant of Gath, with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all, who defied Israel and fell like the rest. None of the men who killed them were famous. They were soldiers. They had names and a line of text each, and that was all. The giants fell. One by one, generation by generation they fell. To Joshua, to Caleb, to David, to ordinary men with ordinary weapons who happened to be standing on the right side of the promise. But here is the question the 6 verses leave open, and it is the reason this story has never stopped being told. If the flood destroyed everything, how were they there again? Scripture does not answer that. It simply lets the names appear, centuries later, in a land the Hebrews were told to walk into anyway. Some things in the Bible are explained. Some are only recorded and left standing in the text like a stone you have to walk around. The watchers are still bound. The old writings are clear about that. Bound in darkness, under seals of fire, waiting for a day that has not come yet. 200 of them swore an oath on a mountain, and every one of them is still keeping it, in a place with no light and no time and no way out. They wanted to come down. They came down, and they were never allowed to go back up. And the last thing Enoch was told before he came down from the heavens for the final time, was that the words he had been given were sealed. Sealed and shut up until the time of the end. Not forgotten. Sealed. The 200 who swore the oath on that mountain have their own story. It is the next film on this channel, and it is waiting for you now. If you want to know what the Watchers taught mankind before they were chained in the dark, subscribe, and I will see you there.